I used to think the creek behind my house was the best part of living here. When I bought this place, tucked neatly inside one of those picture-perfect suburban neighborhoods, the creek was what sealed the deal. It wasn't just water running through the trees, it was life. Birds nested nearby, frogs croaked in summer nights. Kids skipped stones, and when it rained, the creek would come alive, rushing and foaming like a little piece of wilderness. Behind our fences, it made my backyard feel like more than just grass and patio furniture. It felt alive. Back then, the neighborhood was quiet. The HOA existed, sure, but they weren't too loud or overbearing. They sent out the usual newsletters about keeping your lawn green and not leaving garbage bins out too long. Annoying, yes, but nothing worth waging a war over. I paid my dues, nodded along in meetings when I showed up, and lived my life. But all of that changed the year they decided the creek was a problem. It started with whispers, people muttering at mailbox clusters and at barbecues. Someone from the HOA board had mentioned long-term flooding risks. Never mind that in all the years I'd lived here, the creek had never once flooded anyone's home. Sure, when it rained hard, the water rose, but it always stayed in its channel. Nature has a way of balancing itself, something those smug board members never seemed to understand. Then one day, I got the letter. Dear resident, the HOA is pleased to announce a new community safety initiative, the Creek Stabilization Project, to ensure long-term property values, reduce liability, and protect our neighborhood. We will be conducting necessary modifications to the waterway that runs behind our community. This includes reinforcement with concrete barriers to prevent erosion. Construction will begin in 90 days. That's how they worded it. Nice and clean. Reinforcement. Stabilization. What it really meant was they were going to dump tons of concrete into the creek until it wasn't a creek anymore. I remember standing in my backyard, reading that letter while the water sparkled in the sunlight, birds flitting around, dragonflies skimming the surface. My stomach sank. Who fills in a creek? Who decides that a living thing, a natural ecosystem, is an inconvenience? At the next HOA meeting, I raised my hand. I wasn't usually the type to stir the pot, but this felt important. I said, you can't just fill in a creek. That water has to go somewhere. You start messing with it, you're going to change everything: drainage, wildlife, even the foundations of these houses. The board president, a man named Richard Cole, smiled at me with that politician's grin. We've consulted with contractors, and this project is designed to increase safety and protect home values. We appreciate your concern, but we've already voted. Already voted. That was the phrase that stuck with me. The decision wasn't a discussion. It was a decree. A few neighbors clapped politely, others nodded. But I saw doubt in some faces too. People weren't sure. Still, no one wanted to challenge Richard and his little inner circle of board members. Over the next weeks, trucks started arriving. Workers measured, staked, and then the first loads of gravel and concrete appeared. They dug out sections of the creek, built forms, and began pouring. The sound of water mixing with cement churned behind our homes like a warning bell. I felt sick watching it. My backyard started to smell of wet cement and diesel fumes instead of wildflowers and wet earth. The sound of frogs disappeared. Birds stopped coming near. I tried talking to neighbors. Some agreed with me quietly, but shrugged. What can we do? The HOA already spent the money. Others parroted Richard's lines about safety and property values. But I couldn't let it go. One night, I stood at the edge of the creek with a flashlight. They had already poured giant slabs where the water used to curve gracefully. The flow was diverted into a narrow channel of gray, lifeless stone. The natural bend was gone. The way the water pressed against the walls looked wrong, like it was straining to escape. That's when I knew this wasn't just a bad idea. It was dangerous. I started documenting everything. Photos, videos, even measuring water levels after storms. I wanted proof for when, not if, things went wrong. Because I knew they would, and they did. The first big storm came 3 months after the project was finished. It wasn't anything unusual, just one of those heavy summer downpours. But instead of rushing safely down the old natural creek, the water hit the concrete walls, swirled, and then overflowed. It had nowhere to go but out. That night, I watched from my window as water spilled into yards, flooding flower beds, drowning lawns. My own backyard turned into a marsh. But the worst part? The water pooled and it didn't leave. Days later, my yard was still soggy, the grass yellowing from too much water. The concrete had turned the creek into a dam, trapping everything. And it wasn't just me. Other neighbors started complaining. Their yards too were swamps. Some basements even flooded. When I went to the HOA meeting that month, chaos erupted. People shouted over each other. Richard tried to calm everyone with his usual smooth words, but even he looked rattled. The creek stabilization project had backfired. I stood up and said, "I told you this would happen. You blocked a living waterway with concrete. Nature doesn't care about your votes or your contracts. It's going to find a way, and you're all going to pay for it." Some nodded, some glared. Richard tightened his jaw. "This is temporary. Adjustments will be made. We're working with our contractors." But he was lying. And I could see it in his eyes. Because here's the thing, no one realized yet, it wasn't just temporary flooding. The ground itself was changing. And soon, their million-dollar homes wouldn't be standing on solid land anymore. They'd be sinking in a swamp. And all because of the HOA's arrogance. That was only the beginning of the nightmare. The first flood should have been the warning that stopped them. But instead, the HOA doubled down. They called it an adjustment period. That's what Richard, with his smug smile and pressed suit, said in the next meeting. All new infrastructure takes time to settle. The system is sound. We just need to give it time. I remember looking around the room at the worried faces of my neighbors. Some nodded reluctantly, trying to believe him. Others looked just as furious as I felt. But no one spoke up. No one wanted to go head-to-head with the HOA. That was the problem. They controlled the money, the rules, the image of the neighborhood. And they knew most people didn't have the time or stomach to fight them. But I wasn't most people anymore. I'd watched my backyard transform into a swamp. I'd seen my kid's soccer ball float away in stagnant water. I'd pulled up fence. Posts that used to stand solid, now wobbling in loose mud. Every day, the smell of mildew and rotting grass grew stronger. This wasn't just an adjustment period. This was a disaster. The HOA had broken the land. One Saturday morning, I walked the neighborhood with a camera. I wanted to document everything. Mrs. Hughes on the corner showed me her basement, where water seeped through the foundation cracks. The Millers had lost half their garden to standing water. Across the creek, the Williams family had a deck that now leaned, sinking unevenly into soggy ground. Everywhere I looked, the signs were there. Water that wouldn't drain. Soil so soft, it sucked at your shoes. A smell of swamp where there used to be fresh-cut grass. When I brought all this evidence to the board, they dismissed me again. Richard leaned back in his chair, sighing like a teacher humoring a difficult child. We're aware of the situation. But rest assured, the contractors are already working on a drainage solution. This will be resolved shortly. I slapped the photos on the table in front of him. This isn't temporary. This is structural. You've cut off the creek's flow, and the water has nowhere to go. You created a swamp where people's homes are sitting. You think some drains are going to fix this? His eyes narrowed. Lower your tone, please. This meeting is for constructive dialogue. Constructive dialogue. That was his way of saying, shut up. That night, I realized something important. They weren't just wrong. They were hiding something. Because no rational person could look at what was happening and still claim it was fine, unless they had something to lose. So I started digging first. I looked up the contractor the HOA had hired. The name on the notice was Silver Rock Landscaping and Development. Their website looked polished, with stock photos of smiling workers and green lawns. But when I checked their business license, I found something odd. The company was only 6 months old. A brand new company had landed a massive contract with our HOA. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. The company was registered under the name of a man named Thomas Avery. A quick search showed me that Avery wasn't a landscaper by trade. He was a property developer. And not just any property developer. He was a close associate of Richard. Cold my heart sank when I found photos online of Richard and Avery shaking hands at a golf course charity event. Smiling, laughing, like old friends. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about protecting property values. This was a deal. Sweetheart contract. The HOA had poured our dues hundreds of thousands of dollars of homeowner money into Avery's pockets. And in return, Avery dumped concrete into a living creek with no thought of the consequences. The corruption was sitting there, plain as day. But how to prove it? I couldn't just march into a meeting and accuse Richard without hard evidence. The board would shut me down, maybe even fine me for disruption. That was their favorite tool, fines. They fined people for grass length, for trash cans, for parking too close to the curb. They ruled with threats. But I had one thing they didn't: persistence. I filed a public records request with the county for all permits related to the creek stabilization project. Weeks later, a folder landed in my inbox. Inside, I found the permit applications, stamped and approved. Except they weren't erosion control permits like Richard claimed. They were decorative landscaping modifications. Decorative? They hadn't even been honest with the county. They'd sold this as some beautification project, not major waterway reconstruction, which meant the county had no idea what they'd actually done. That was my leverage. But while I planned my next move, the swamp kept spreading by late summer. The neighborhood looked nothing like the glossy brochures the realtors had once handed out. Lawns turned yellow. Patches of mud spread, and mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. At night, the sound of frogs returned. Not charming this time, but overwhelming. A chorus that made it impossible to sleep. And then the sinking began. It started small. Cracks in driveways. Uneven steps. Wooden fences leaning at strange angles. People chalked it up to settling, but I knew better. The soil had changed. Waterlogged earth doesn't hold weight the same way. I'll never forget the first house that showed real damage. To Patterson's Place. A 2-story brick home, worth close to $1 million when they bought it. One morning, I walked past and saw their front porch had dropped 3 inches. By the end of the week, the gap had grown to 6. You could slide your hand between the porch and the house. The HOA sent a letter blaming natural shifting of land. But everyone in the neighborhood knew it wasn't natural. It was the creek that the whispers returned. Neighbors started talking in hushed tones, asking if their homes were safe, if insurance would cover this, if the HOA would take responsibility. But Richard kept smiling, kept insisting it was under control, until the second storm hit. This one was worse than the first. Days of steady rain. The kind of rain that turns streets into rivers. I stood at my back window again, just like before, and watched in horror as the water rose. This time, it didn't just flood the yards, it pushed up against foundations. Seeped into garages. People waded in knee-deep water trying to save what they could. And when it was over, the neighborhood didn't drain. It sat, weeks of stagnant water. A real swamp. That's when people started turning on the HOA. Emergency. Meetings were called. Voices were raised. For the first time, Richard looked nervous. He blamed the contractor. He promised immediate solutions. But the cracks were showing, not just in the homes, but in his control over the neighborhood. And I knew I had him cornered, because I had the paperwork. The proof of his lies, and the connection to Avery. The only question left was how to use it, because once I exposed Richard, the whole neighborhood would know the truth. But the truth wasn't going to just embarrass him, it was going to destroy everything. By the time the second storm passed, the neighborhood wasn't a neighborhood anymore. It was a basin, a bowl that collected rain and held it, smothering grass and soil until everything smelled of rot. The sound of generators and sump pumps echoed through the nights. People carried wet furniture out of their basements. Their once perfect homes now gutted like abandoned shells. For years, this community had been a showcase. Realtors bragged about the million-dollar homes, the manicured lawns, the family-friendly sidewalks. Now it looked like a place no one would willingly live. Driveways cracked, basements leaked, lawns sank into marshes. You could see mosquitoes buzzing in clouds, and when the wind blew just right, the stench of stagnant water drifted into every house, and still. The HOA lied. Richard stood in front of us at an emergency meeting and said, "We are in contact with additional contractors. The situation is temporary. Insurance will cover certain damages," but the people weren't buying it anymore. I watched my neighbors' faces as he spoke. Mrs. Hughes, who'd been loyal to the HOA for years, shook her head the entire time. The Millers, whose son had developed rashes from the mosquito bites, openly scoffed. Even the Williams family, one of Richard's closest allies, avoided eye contact with him. The tide was turning, and I knew I had to act. The documents I'd uncovered, the fake permits, the contractor's shell company, the connection between Richard and Avery, those were my weapons. But using them meant drawing a line in the sand. Once I exposed Richard, I'd be his enemy in a war I wasn't sure I could win. Because the HOA didn't just hold power in meetings, they had legal authority. They could fine me, sue me, even put a lien on my home if I pushed too far. Fighting them meant risking everything. But looking around at my flooded neighborhood, I realized something. I'd already lost everything. What good was a house sitting in a swamp? What value did it have if the foundation was cracking and the backyard was nothing but mud? So I made my choice. The next morning, I printed every document I had. I put them in a binder, copies of permits, business records, photos of Richard and Avery together. Even emails I'd managed to get from a disgruntled board member, who quietly slipped them to me. And then I went door to door. I showed my neighbors. The truth, at first, they didn't believe it. But when they saw the permits stamped landscaping instead of flood control, when they saw Avery's name and Richard's smiling face in a charity brochure, their anger boiled over. This was never about safety, I told them. It was about money. They stole our dues to line their pockets, and now our homes are sinking because of it. By the end of the week, half the neighborhood had copies of my binder. The truth was spreading like fire through dry grass, then Richard knew it. The next HOA meeting was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The usual polite order was gone. People shouted, demanded refunds, screamed about their homes being ruined. Richard banged his gavel until his hand shook, but no one cared. Finally, I stood. I opened my binder, held up the documents, and said, "Do you all want to know why your homes are flooding? Why your basements are ruined? Why our neighborhood is rotting? Because Richard Cole handed our money to his friend's fake company and buried a creek in concrete." That's the truth. The room erupted. Richard tried to deny it, tried to twist words, but I had proof. Neighbors flipped through the copies, waving them in the air, shouting, "You lied to us, and you ruined our homes." For the first time, Richard looked cornered. His face went pale, sweat dripping down his temple. And then he snapped. "You think you know everything," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think this was my idea? Do you think I wanted this? You're all fools." The room went silent. His mask had slipped. That's when I knew there was something deeper, something he wasn't saying. After the meeting, as people stormed out in anger, Richard caught my arm. His grip was tight, desperate. He leaned close and hissed, "You don't understand. You've opened something you can't close. Walk away before it's too late." His words chilled me. This wasn't just corruption. This wasn't just greed. There was something else at play. That night, unable to sleep, I walked the edges of the swampy creek with a flashlight. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Frogs croaked, insects buzzed, and the water sat black and unmoving. I pointed my light into the murk, and that's when I saw it at the edge of the concrete barrier. Where the water pressed hardest, the ground had shifted. The soil was collapsing inward, and beneath the waterline, through the cracks, I saw movement, not just water movement. Something else, something shifting below. Like the earth itself was restless, and I remembered Richard's words. "You don't understand." He wasn't just covering up corruption. He was hiding something buried here, something the creek had been holding back. And now, with the concrete damming the water, it was starting to wake up. After that night at the creek, I couldn't stop thinking about Richard's warning. Something beneath the concrete had shifted. Something that had been dormant until we trapped the water. My gut told me this was bigger than greed, bigger than a bad decision. This was a disaster waiting to explode. I started investigating more aggressively. I spent hours going through property records, old maps of the neighborhood, even geological surveys from the county archives. That's when I found decades-old maps showing the original creek path. It wasn't just a creek. It was part of a natural watershed that ran underground, feeding into springs and small ponds throughout the area. When they poured concrete over it, the HOA hadn't just blocked a creek. They had obstructed the entire underground water system. That meant pressure was building beneath the surface, trapped and unseen. The land wasn't going to settle. It was going to revolt. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the neighborhood, talking to residents about what I had found. Most were terrified. The thought that their homes were perched on an unstable, waterlogged foundation made their stomachs twist. The Millers refused to let their children outside. Mrs. Hughes covered her garden with tarps, trying to keep what soil she could salvage from washing away. I knew the HOA needed to be confronted, but I also needed evidence to stop them, legally. That's when I discovered something else. Emails between Richard and Avery. They were detailed, showing every step of the project, every cost inflated, every shortcut taken. They hadn't just ignored environmental concerns. They had actively concealed them. I took copies to a lawyer specializing in HOA and environmental law. His reaction confirmed my fears. "This isn't just a civil matter," he said. "This is criminal negligence. You're talking about potential charges for falsifying permits and destroying natural waterways. And the damage isn't just your property. This affects the entire ecosystem." With legal backing, I started organizing the neighborhood. We formed an independent committee, documenting every flooded yard, every damaged foundation, every lost tree. Photos, videos, soil samples, everything. The HOA had power over meetings, newsletters, and dues, but they couldn't control what we could record and report. Meanwhile, the underground water pressure continued to build. Small sinkholes began appearing near the concrete creek. At first, just soft spots in yards. Then, one morning, a portion of the Patterson driveway collapsed completely. Their car sank halfway into mud, and the neighbors gasped at the sight. People were panicking. The insurance adjusters started arriving, and they couldn't believe the scale of the disaster. One told me privately, "I've never seen anything like this. The whole area is compromised. Homes might not be safe at all." The HOA tried to spin it again, sending out letters claiming temporary settling and contractor issues. But by now, no one trusted them. Richard's authority was crumbling. I also discovered another layer of corruption. Avery, the contractor, wasn't just a friend of Richard's. He had been funneling kickbacks to other board members too. Secret bank accounts, offshore transactions, consulting fees that were actually payments for approving the project. The web of deceit was enormous. I compiled all of this into a single dossier and decided it was time to go public. But the moment I started posting online, the threats began. Anonymous emails, messages on social media, even a few late-night knocks. At the door, someone didn't want the truth to come out. One evening, I found Richard standing at the edge of my property, glaring from across the yard. He didn't speak, just watched. That silence was worse than any threat. I knew the confrontation was inevitable. The next HOA meeting was explosive. I arrived early with my dossier. Neighbors had copies, and everyone was ready. When the meeting began, I stood up and laid out everything. The permits, the emails, the geological surveys, the pictures of the swamp, the collapsed driveways, the hidden kickbacks. Every lie Richard had told was exposed. The room erupted. People shouted, demanded immediate action, and finally called for Richard to resign. But he refused. He tried to dismiss us, threaten us with fines, even filed a temporary injunction against the meeting itself. But that night, after everyone had gone home, I went back to the creek one last time. The water was rising faster than before. Small cracks in the concrete widened. Beneath the murky surface, the pressure of trapped water had begun to lift portions of the concrete slabs. Trees leaned unnaturally, and the ground trembled faintly beneath my feet. I realized that the concrete wasn't going to hold. Nature, which had been silenced, was now reclaiming its power. The HOA hadn't just made a swamp. They had destabilized the entire neighborhood. And there was no stopping it. I knew Richard's arrogance had set something in motion that was beyond anyone's control. The concrete, the kickbacks, the lies, they had all created a perfect storm. And the twist, the part no one expected, was just beginning. Because when the HOA had tried to cover the creek, they didn't just bury water. They had buried secrets. Secrets that were starting to surface. By the time the final part of the disaster unfolded, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Streets had puddles large enough to resemble small lakes. Lawns were sodden and collapsing, and the smell of stagnant water filled every home. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly, their buzzing an endless reminder of the environment we had destroyed. The creek, once alive and winding gracefully through the neighborhood, had become a lifeless concrete channel, holding back a pressure it could no longer contain. I watched from my backyard as small sections of the concrete began to shift and crack. The hidden watershed beneath the neighborhood was forcing its way up, lifting slabs of concrete, breaking through drainage pipes, and creating new sinkholes. Every crack, every puddle, every collapsing driveway was proof of what I had been saying. All along, nature doesn't forgive stupidity, greed, or corruption. Richard Cole finally realized the scale of what he had done. He called emergency meetings, sent out apology letters, and tried to organize contractors to patch the mess. But it was too late. The water was relentless, and his millions in property value were evaporating. Homes once worth a fortune now teetered on mud, some partially submerged. The HOA's authority collapsed with every passing day as neighbors openly defied board decisions, demanding accountability and restitution. But the real twist came when I returned to the creek one night to document the damage. In the shadows of the swamp, I noticed shapes moving beneath the water. At first, I thought it was debris, fallen branches perhaps, or the remains of lawns, eroded into the flood. But the shapes were deliberate, almost alive. I leaned closer and saw them clearly. Twisted tree roots and soil had formed grotesque patterns, almost human, as if the earth itself was showing its anger. And then I realized, the worst part, the creek had not been the only thing the HOA had tampered with. During construction, in their rush to pour concrete and hide the cost over ages, they had blocked not just the surface creek, but an old underground drainage system, a system that connected to a small natural pond beyond the neighborhood. That pond, which had survived for generations, was now feeding into the swollen backyard swamps, making the problem exponentially worse. Suddenly, the backyard of Richard's own house, the grandest home in the neighborhood, began to sink. Trees leaned dangerously, and the edge of his patio crumbled into thick mud. I realized then, with grim satisfaction, that the very arrogance that had fueled this project was now turning against him. His million-dollar estate, built to impress, was now sinking into the swamp he had created. Neighbors gathered to watch, some filming with their phones, some silently staring. No one cheered. This wasn't entertainment. It was a lesson in hubris. But the real revelation came a week later. While walking along a partially submerged path near the creek, I noticed a small metal box sticking out of the mud. Curious, I dug it up and opened it. Inside were stacks of unaccounted checks, canceled invoices, and ledgers detailing every bribe, kickback, and secret transaction tied to the HOA board. It was all there, evidence of fraud, deception, and abuse of power, all hidden in the very land they had tried to dominate. Kay took the box to the county authorities. Within days, the HOA board members were under investigation. Contractors were subpoenaed. Richard, Cole, Avery, and the others faced charges ranging from fraud to environmental violations. Their arrogance had not only ruined homes, but left them legally exposed. The neighborhood slowly began to recover. The concrete slabs were removed, and the creek was restored to its original path. Engineers and environmental specialists reshaped the land, planting native flora and redirecting water safely. Mosquitoes remained a problem for a while, but the community came together, repairing what had been damaged and reclaiming their homes. As for me, I learned a few things that year. I learned that standing up against corruption requires courage and persistence. I learned that nature has a memory and a way of punishing arrogance. And I learned that the small, quiet decisions made by those in power can have consequences that ripple far beyond their control. In the end, the million-dollar homes that once sat proudly above the creek now stood humbled. Reminders of greed and the importance of listening to the land itself. And the neighborhood, scarred but wiser, finally found a balance between human ambition and the unstoppable forces of nature. HOA arrogance had tried to fill a creek with concrete. Nature had filled their hubris with consequences far heavier than any board vote could ever contain. And in that swamp, every lesson was crystal clear. The end. Thanks for watching. Hoped you liked it. If you watched till the end, please comment "end" so that we could understand you were with us till the end. As well as please let us know where are you watching from. Before leaving, please hit the subscribe button, comment your thought, and share with your nearest and dearest one. See you in the next one. Until to the next one, stay happy. Goodbye.